How are kids supposed to do great things in the world if they aren't allowed to live in the world? She says further, kids are a lot smarter than adults think. I have friends who are way smarter than I am, but because they're stuck inside their house or school all day, no one knows.
Free Talk Live.
I really have a lot to say about this because I thought it was very fascinating how there was a disconnect between the thing that you were talking about before with age of consent versus that. Plus, all of a sudden, we're talking about Hilda. What was her last name? Lysiak.
It's spelled Lysiak. So I'm going to guess Lysiak.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it just seems like the average cop is not prepared for a child from the internet. It's like they are not prepared for someone who is as well versed and is well prepared to be able to take on adult on.
I don't think it has to do with it being a child from the internet, because every kid these days was raised, with a tablet in their hands.
But I think that's what he's saying. I think he's saying that it's like this generation has been raised with so much information that they're maybe more adult. Is that what you're trying to say?
Are you saying that you don't think that Hilda is special? Because I think she's unusual. I think that
she is, yeah.
I think that young people, whether they're on the internet or not, are still being inculcated with the idea that the police are in charge and that they need to do whatever they tell you to do, you need to do, because they're the police and they tell you what to do. That's what police do. I don't think that message is any less prevalent in young people's lives. And one of the things that she says in her interview on brightlightmag.com is these, like her friends basically are essentially sheltered. She talks about how they're basically kept at home and that the parents... Here, this is what she says. In response to a question from Brightlight, the interviewer, Brightlight says, "You've said, quote, I think a lot of adults tell their kids they can do anything, but at the end of the day, they don't actually let them do anything," unquote. Can you elaborate, and what are some examples? She says, "It's so true. I was the only 7-year-old I knew who was allowed to bike around town. The only one. In a town of 6,000 is where she grew up.
A town of 6,000, yeah, you can bike around town.
She's the only one."
Yeah, that's crazy.
She says, I have friends who... hold on, Rat Speed, the rest of the quote.
Sorry.
She says, I have friends who are 11, and they aren't even allowed to walk into town.
That's crazy.
She says, a lot of parents are such phonies. They say how they embrace their kids' creativity, but hardly let them cross the street without freaking out. How are kids supposed to do great things in the world if they aren't allowed to live in the world? She says, further, kids are a lot smarter than adults think. I have friends who are way smarter than I am, but because they're stuck inside their house or school all day, no one knows. She says, finally, the best thing about my parents is they get out of the way. And isn't that what we want for our lives in government? We want the government to get out of the way so we can have better lives, so we can have more freedom to become the people that, we were intended to
Practice
be.
What you preach, I guess.
And so I don't know if I buy the idea that just because kids are online that they know anything about police accountability or that they know anything about how to stand up to themselves or interact with them. You don't know anything about interacting with the cops until you do it. You can watch a bunch of videos. That's cool. But until you actually get into the streets and have a cop try to intimidate you, and then you pull out your video camera and see how you handle that, it's just theory until you get into the streets. So I don't buy that claim. Go ahead, Rat Speed.
Well, going back to the question that you asked, which is she special or not? It depends on what you're asking about. When you say special, are you saying that she has some kind of innate ability to do this? Or like you just said, is it just simply that people are getting out of the way? So, I mean, we have a global platform which enables people to grow faster than ever before and learn information and have access to information and be treated as equals, so long as you don't have this prejudice that someone who's younger can't or won't or, is unable to do these kind of things, right? So the problem is that you're receiving so much resistance from legacy culture, from people who did not grow up online. And so here's the thing about is, yes, it has something to do about parenting and just basically parenting being, getting out of the way and allowing someone to grow at their own pace. However, at the same time, I also think that the internet itself has something to do with it because you have access to information, so therefore you can gain more knowledge so long as you are allowed to.
Oh, no, I would
agree. This is a really, and this was getting touched on a little bit earlier, but I think with the public school question, I do think that we are really doing our culture almost a existential disservice by having public schools be the same as they've always been, when we've got kids who have access to in their pockets that they're not allowed to turn on. They have access to basically all the information in the world, more than any scholar 50 years ago would have been able to access for years, and yet they're being quote unquote educated by being told to sit there and listen to someone at the front of a classroom give them just a snippet of information when they could have Googled it for themselves.
Sure.
20 or 50 or 100 times faster than it's being delivered to them.
The educational system today is, it's an embarrassment. It's awful. It's backwards. It's contrary to what these kids are able to learn. And I agree, Ratspeed, I agree with you that Hilda Leshak would not exist in the form that she is were it not for the internet. Okay, yes. So I agree with you there. The information's out there for the people who want to encounter that information. It's out there. However, your typical teenager, let's say, and by the way, I've been pleased with the young people who've called the show tonight. We had a couple very young callers. They asked good questions. Yeah. They had, serious topics they wanted to discuss. And not everything has to be serious, but a lot of the times, the callers who are younger on this show, they just want to call and say the F word on the radio. Okay? So just because you have the internet doesn't mean that the person who's using that tool is going to use it to enrich themselves.
Well, it's a double-edged sword.
Right. They're going to look at a bunch of memes. They're going to look at porn. They're going to They're going to play video games. So I mean, just because you know just because you're the meme king doesn't mean you're going to know anything about how to interact with the police. Right. So if you want to learn how to interact with the police, that information's there. There's a zillion cop block videos where you can watch incredible history of wonderful activists doing non-cooperation with the cops. But Hilda's different because she went in a different route. She went down the responsible road and used the internet to create something that hadn't existed before, a platform for somebody who's as young as she is to be a journalist. She could never have gotten this job with a newspaper 20 years ago, right?
So maybe it's not that her parents, maybe she even, it's nice that she sees it as her parents getting out of the way, but actually they're not necessarily getting out of the way. They're just not an impediment. They're clearly helping to guide her, right? So they're being
her dad
a mentor,
was a reporter,
a guide, right? So she's getting guidance as opposed to being directed and ordered and made to go in a certain place.
I think the word that we might be looking for is empowering.
Sure, or encouraging, because she's
been allowed
courageous.
And empowered and encouraged to do all these things.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
And the internet is the linchpin.
So you have these cultural tailbones, if you will. People that are expecting one type of situation to arise, and then they encounter someone who has grown up with a different situation. And I have to say, a lot of this has to do with American ideals and puritanical ideals, things like that. People from different countries, they grow at different rates. I hate the word develop, by the way. I'm not a piece of film. I'm a living person. So, I like to use the word grow because you grow. You experience things.
Right.
And different cultures have different ways of handling things. And unfortunately, this culture, the legacy culture that we're holding on to based off of primitive, devolved sets of ideals, they're becoming impediments. And I think it's doing more harm than good. The culture itself is just not able to cope with this sudden rate of growth.
Being young today in the world of the internet, where knowledge of all sorts, including false information, is at your fingertips in a way that it has never been in past decades. And what that allows people to do, it can allow them to just screw off and do what kids have done forever, which is, nothing important. Or it can allow you to break into a world that you've never, in previous generations would never have been able to do. Like Hilda Leshak, she's 12 years old, started doing journalism at age 8, in her hometown in Pennsylvania, and has been doing so since. Made headlines this week for being confronted by a police officer in Arizona. Got some really interesting video of that we played the audio from earlier tonight. We've got Rat Speed on the line with us. We're going to continue this discussion about what's different now, because if young people are allowed to grow, and that's the term that I agree that Rat Speed used earlier, if they're allowed to grow up in the way that they want instead of being forced into this mold, this one-size-fits-all mold that, you got to get your high school degree, you got to get your college degree, you got to get a job, and then you'll retire and have some kids. And there's this sort of typical path that people have for generations been strongly encouraged to go down. And she's been able to break off of that path because her parents didn't force her to do the typical teenage kid or little kid role of just playing with your toys until you're old enough to do whatever it is that teenagers do when they don't work, which is screw off.
Yep.
And she started working at age 8, trying to break the news in her hometown, and apparently successfully actually breaking some stories.
Which I think, honestly, any 8-year-olds are hype to do stuff like that. If you're like, hey, you want to write some news stories? You like news? You want to write some news stories? 8-year-olds are like, heck yeah, I want to do that. It's just up to you to keep them interested and excited about it. And if you do that, of course they will.
Well, if you allow them to continue, then they'll probably stay excited about it, as opposed to telling them, no, you just need to, you need to stay safe. You need to stay at home all day. She's saying her friends are forced to stay home. They're not allowed to even get on their bicycle and bike into town. They're not allowed to even walk into town at age 11, some of her other friends, and she's the only one who has the ability to have some, they call it free-range kids. There's Lenore Skenazy made a big, real popular blog about this. It wouldn't surprise me if I went to her blog and found this story there. I haven't been there recently. But let's bring Rat Speed back on the line here. Rat Speed, you're back on. You were going to tell us something about a TED Talk. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's 3 different ones. I won't go into all of them, but I will mention their names. The first one was Sir Ken Robinson. He talked about old paradigms of education and how it's stifling creativity, right? Everyone's basically being treated like a machine. You have to go to school at the same age. If you don't conform, you're not going to succeed, that kind of stuff. He's always talked about that. And then that got into Salman Khan from Khan Academy. And he's basically talking about breaking through those paradigms by allowing people to use the internet as a one world classroom and be able to learn at your own pace, right?
Sure.
And so then Eddie Obeng, he talked about smart failure. He was particularly talking about it in the corporate environment, but it also applies to growing up and having an education and having empowerment and abilities. People are afraid of failure. And in the workplace, they're afraid of getting fired. So you tell them to be creative and try new things and use this new internet thing that we have. And people are afraid of that. So they end up using their old thought patterns instead of the new ones. They're afraid of failure. So when it comes to kids, when it comes to young people, people are afraid of them failing. They're afraid of them hurting themselves. They're afraid of them getting into trouble or just not. And so that's the problem, is that the culture and thus the people that are trying to supposedly raise children to be successful adults they're not, because unless you have an open mind, unless you have the knowledge, the understanding of the internet, and just having an open mind and having the right attitude toward parenting, to have an authoritative, in other words, someone not authoritarian where you're, it's like, you can't do this, you can't do that, but someone who gives those abilities, gives those opportunities.
Well, the ability to fail and learn from failure is that's what life is about.
But you have to fail,
right? You have to, and so the mentality of these parents or educators or politicians or whoever it is we're talking about that promulgates this concept of be afraid of failure, right? Be afraid. It's fear-based mentality, number one, which is not a good.
Be afraid in general,
right?
Just
right.
Be afraid
Being
of
in a place of fear is not a place from which you can grow.
Yes.
And failure is the only real way you can grow. So you have to understand that failure is a natural part of life. It's something that you have to experience. And a parent who understands this is going to stand back. They're going to let their children fail. They're going to understand that that's important for their growth.
and this affects laws. This affects legal liabilities.
Sure.
There are laws in place that actually punish adults from being allowed to give people who are young better opportunities. Like, for instance, most banks, most major banks at least, won't even allow you to open up a bank account on your own. You have to go through your parents, and you have to make sure that they watch after your money, and you're not allowed to touch it. Meanwhile, you have a bunch of young people, artists in particular, who want to open up a PayPal account so that way they can take commissions, or so that they can do all these things, and they're not allowed to. So
this is new. All of this is new, though. Like, Jonathan Haidt wrote this book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and it's like, this is honestly within the last, let's say, 25 years. On the bank tip, I remember being 12 years old. My grandfather gave me $100 and took me down, and I opened up a savings account, and I had the little book and everything. I remember going to that bank, going from my junior high, which was down the street, going to that bank and pulling money out and putting money in. And I never had my parents there. So if they're doing this, like, and so this is, that was probably what? So that was probably like over 25 years ago. So this is new. This whole thing of like safe spaces and all of this, it's like this coddling of children, participation trophies, all of that. This is not, this is new, dude. This is like the last 20 years, and it's a big problem.
You know, I had a girlfriend who was a teenager under the age of 18 and was looking into banking laws here in New Hampshire, and there's actually not a law that prevents banks from allowing young people under the age of majority to open an account. It's just bank policy. And so in theory, there could be a bank that decided to allow a young person to open up their own account. That if you could persuade the manager that you could, you were responsible enough to do this, they in theory could go ahead and allow it. Now, how often or if that ever happens, I don't know. But it's not prohibited by law, at least in New Hampshire. There probably are some states where it is, on the books in the law. But in theory, that could happen. And in your case, Vin, it may have been that it was part of the account where you just needed your mom to open it, but you may have had access to
I don't even
withdrawal.
know that I needed. See, this was like an older. It eventually got bought by Bank of America. I think under these big corporate banks, they just don't want the liability, I'm sure. But back in the day, I think it could probably have happened.
Rat Speed, good call. Thanks for sharing your thoughts here with us tonight.
Free Talk Live. Listen live 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern, or grab the podcast. It's all at freetalklive.com.